Hello tankers and tankettes, and welcome to a WoT Tanks video. I was tempted to call this like WoT Tank Game, but that was a bit clunky, and WoT Tanks is barely any better, but what the hell. I'm going to take a kind of an overview of both World of Tanks and War Thunder. I'm going to do a compare and contrast, because War Thunder has just gone into open beta with the ground forces portion of the game, and naturally there's a lot of, I feel anyway, there's a lot of interest from the World of Tanks community, because hey, it's another World of Tanks kind of game, except it isn't really, but we'll come to that. So this has been on the cards for a while, War Thunder, with the ground forces. There was a lot of interest when the open beta stuff first started to be, when we first started to see footage of that and see what kind of shape the game would be in. Bear in mind, it's only just gone open beta. It's not by any means finished yet, but what's there is actually pretty playable. It's not bad. It's got some balance issues, but hey, that's also true of World of Tanks. But we're not really going to talk about stuff like balance issues. What I'm going to talk about is more the kind of core game philosophies, because there are some fairly stark differences that actually make these, despite their seeming similarities, it actually makes them really pretty different games. And these fall into a couple of areas, and I'm going to start with the big one, which might not sound like a big one, but it probably is the biggest one, and that is hit points bars versus no hit points bars. Now, World of Tanks is aimed at the daddy demographic, as the that's not my phrase. That's actually lifted from a Q&A answer from For the Record, and basically they've Wargaming have pitched this game as something that's fairly easy to get into, but there is obviously there's a learning curve. You know, it's easy to get into but hard to master, and that's not a bad thing. But they've kind of pitched it being quite easy to grasp and understand for somebody that isn't necessarily a hardcore gamer. And the hit points bar is, I mean, grossly unrealistic. You know, there's no semblance of it. It's total arcade. It's just pure straight up this is a video game, and it's really easy for anyone to understand, because what happens is you've got your tank, you've got an enemy tank, you've got hit points, they've got hit points, you shoot them and you take off their hit points, and it's a very linear system. You can see exactly how many hit points they've got, you know how many shots it will take to kill them, and you have some idea of how many hits you can take, what enemies you can face off against, what guns you can, it's very easy to grasp, even if obviously the individual bits of knowledge might take a while to pick up. Whereas War Thunder is an entirely different beast, and it always has been, and it's quite easy. Just playing the planes portion of the game, it's quite easy to see the tremendous differences. But I think it's in even more stark contrast with the ground forces portion of the game. How it works is very, very different. Now, in World of Tanks, not only does your tank have hit points, but you have various tank modules. They have hit points. You can damage somebody's modules and impair their efficiency. And there are some, like for instance, the ammo rack or fuel tanks or the engine, where you can cause really critical damage. You can burn somebody out, or you can ammo rack them potentially from full health. Now, in War, I said World of Tanks again there. In War Thunder, it's basically all modules. That's all your tank has, and the dice throw system probably works in a very similar way. If you get shot somewhere and it strikes a module, there will be a dice throw to determine the level of damage you're taking. And in World of Tanks, that's kind of hit points based. It may or may not be in War Thunder. We don't know. The War Thunder devs don't tend to disclose that level of detail about the mechanics of the game. But my guess is that there's something along those lines, and basically it determines whether the module is damaged or knocked out entirely, or for the case of a crew member, it's basically the same, whether they're injured or killed, and how much that impairs your efficiency, and also how long it takes to repair your tank. Now, what this means for War Thunder is that instead of this kind of very easy to understand linear progression that you have with World of Tanks, where you've got a dwindling pool of hit points to deal with, In War Thunder, you could sit still and be shot 30 times in a row, and you might bounce everything and take no damage. Or you could get ammo racked or burned out from the very first shot that you take. There is absolutely no way of predicting which way it's going to go. Obviously, you can still tell from what's shooting you whether they're likely to be more or less dangerous to your tank. If you've got very little armor and you're facing a tank with a big gun, let's say you're in a, I don't know, let's pick a ridiculous example. You're in the starting Russian tank, you're in the T-26, facing a King Tiger. Yeah, that's not going to go well for you. But if it's two more evenly matched opponents, then it can be totally unpredictable. The RNG compared to World of Tanks it's on a whole other level, and I think that's going to make it harder to get into for a lot of people. So that kind of works against it. If you're enthusiastic about War Thunder generally, then you're already used to that with the planes, because that's how the planes work, basically. But when you're flying around in the sky, it's a lot easier to jink and dodge and get away from other people shooting at you than it is when you're stuck on the ground, and it becomes a whole different thing, basically. Now, I've mentioned planes already. Of course, one of the features, one of the selling points of War Thunder Ground Forces is that, unlike World of Tanks, where, yes, okay, there's World of Warplanes as well, but those are basically separated from each other, whereas War Thunder aims to give the combined arms experience. Eventually they're going to add ships into the mix as well, but the idea is that you are fighting on the same battlefield as players in tanks, other players in planes, and eventually players in ships. This has massive consequences because there's not only other players in tanks to think about, but there are other players in planes to think about, and that's reflected by the fact that not only do we have kind of light, medium, heavy tanks, tank destroyers, no artillery class in War Thunder, interestingly, but there are artillery strikes, or mortar strikes rather, but basically there's the whole aerial dimension that's been added, and that means that mobility, I mean, it's an important thing in World of Tanks, but in War Thunder it's even more so. It's different between the different game modes, I will say that. In arcade mode you're going to have a lot of people flying planes, and therefore the aerial kind of, the number of people flying around dropping bombs and the number of people flying around strafing tanks is going to be much higher than simulator, and I think that's probably going to actually make simulator tank battles more attractive to a lot of people than simulator plane battles, because simulator plane battles require they require a fairly extensive knowledge, you know, that requires kind of flight sim level knowledge of how to fly virtual aircraft, and it practically requires a joystick to play properly, so you need the investment in hardware as well. Whereas with ground forces, that's not really an issue. You know, you can play arcade with keyboard and mouse just as well as you can play simulator with keyboard and mouse. So it has less of an impact in sim battles, but I imagine in arcade battles especially, you're going to have people farming tank kills with, especially those high altitude bombers. So it's always been a thing in War Thunder that there's kind of a lack of cooperation between people flying fighters and people flying bombers, and it's almost I think this is maybe not going to work in War Thunder's favour, at least in arcade mode, because you're going to have people farming kills, and it's going to drive people away from playing tanks, because you will get people farming kills with bombers, and there's not going to necessarily be the fighter support to keep those bombers away, because the fighters will probably all be trying to strafe the tanks as well. So I'm not quite sure how they're going to make that work in terms of balance, but because simulator has such a high skill level required to fly the planes, you know, the few people that are going to be flying around in planes are probably going to be quite skilled, so there's still going to be that threat, but there's going to be a lot less of them. So while this is obviously a fairly major difference between the two games, I think it's not going to be that major in the scheme of things. I think we will naturally see people over time gravitate to realistic and sim battles, because there's just gonna be that many fewer people playing. And even though in sim battles you get much less hand-holding than you do in arcade battles, it's actually still a heck of a lot easier to get into, to grasp, than it is flying in sim battles, because that requires a whole other level of knowledge. Now, another really major difference is the whole XP and research system. In World of Tanks, it's again quite linear. You are in a tank, you have to play that tank to research the tank that comes after it, and that can be frustrating because there are some tanks that aren't very good to play. There are some national lines in World of Tanks where you've got a couple of good tanks maybe further down the line, but to get to them you have to play through a couple of stinkers, and that can be off-putting for some people. There are some tanks, especially at high tiers, that you just don't see very often, and that's because people give up before they get to them, so that doesn't help with the diversity of the game. But again, it's a pretty easy system to understand, and for those individual tanks as well, you're always going to finish off with a stronger vehicle than you started with because of the various module upgrades and the things that you can add to your tank. Now, again, War Thunder, totally different. For one thing, the research tree is it's actually undergone some fairly major changes in the way they've been the way they've set out the research system, but at the core of it is you don't have to play the tank that comes before a tank you want necessarily. You can research a vehicle from any other vehicle, because you set a research target on your tech tree and then you go away and play battles in all of your other tanks that you've got, and what you the research points that you get all go to that one vehicle that you've targeted. Now, there are some caveats to that. The higher up you go, you know, if you just play a rank 1 vehicle and you're trying to unlock a rank 4 vehicle, that is an incredibly inefficient way to do it. You're not going to get many research points doing that. Not only because obviously you're going to get less in a rank 1 than you are in a higher rank vehicle, but the way the research system works is that it's always more efficient to there are certain kind of groupings in the tiers where it's always kind of more efficient to research something from within that group. So you say you're trying to research your first rank 3 vehicle, it's more efficient to research that from rank 2 vehicles than it is from rank 1 vehicles, if that makes sense. I probably said that in a very Byzantine way, but this has I think that's a positive thing. That's a pretty nice thing in comparison. The downside of that is the way the crew system works in War Thunder. You don't really get garage slots, you don't get you can have an infinite number of tanks. The limiting factor is the number of crews that you can have, and this is where the economy comes into play, because in order to buy a vehicle, even if you've never played let's say you've got a rank 4 vehicle and you haven't ever played the rank 3 that comes before it, you've been researching that with other vehicles, you still have to buy that one that you've never played to actually get the one that comes after it, and you have to put it on a crew, and that all costs quite a lot of credits, especially as you get further up the game. So the grind for credits is actually, I think, a lot worse in War Thunder than it is in World of Tanks, which is kind of it's kind of related to the whole research tree and the way they've laid that out. So yeah, it's research-wise, I really prefer War Thunder, but in terms of the game economy, I very much prefer World of Tanks. It gives you more options, and it's less kind of... War Thunder all-round feels more like they want your money a heck of a lot more than World of Tanks does. I'll put it that way. And that's clear through the economy, and that's clear through the research system as well. I'll also add a little caveat here, or a little side note about crews themselves, because that's another thing that's a very big difference. World of Tanks, you get a named crew that is tied to a vehicle. You can retrain them for different vehicles, for a cost, of course. The training cost is still there in War Thunder, and like I said, it gets very expensive at the higher tiers, whereas in World of Tanks that's always a fixed cost. It's gonna cost the same to train a crew for your tier 1 vehicle than it is for your tier 10 vehicle, and it doesn't scale. That's something I really wish War Thunder had. I don't know why they make it so expensive. I mean, I haven't progressed that far, and I don't play it enough to actually basically have the credits, and because I don't have a premium account, it's way more grindy in terms of credits than World of Tanks is, I feel. But I'm not exactly coming at this from the most fair perspective, because I've had a premium account in World of Tanks for a while, whereas I've never had one in War Thunder, and I've only got one premium War Thunder plane. Because I suck at planes, you know, I still don't make that many credits from it. So crews are, like I've said, you've got a certain number of crews. They don't have names or anything. The grinding for crew skills is absolutely horrendous. I mean, it really is. The first couple of crew points, the skills are, because you get it divided between different crew members, and it's kind of like you have as many crew members as the vehicle requires. You don't have to recruit extra crew members for an individual crew, but it can mean that the costs just get really expensive. And again, this is Gaijin trying to get you to spend money on the game, because you can basically drop some money on crew points and buy yourself the equivalent of like a 600%, what would be a 600% crew in World of Tanks. And in that way, it is a lot more pay to win, because those crew skills really do have a significant effect on how well you're actually able to hit stuff, how well you can repair your tank, what your reload times are. You know, these are not insignificant things that you can basically give yourself a significant boost just by dropping some money on the game. So that's a criticism of War Thunder that I've always had, and it very much remains true for Ground Forces as well. And the last thing I really want to mention in terms of really core differences between the two games is the spotting system. And this is a totally different experience between the two games. World of Tanks, unspotted vehicles are physically invisible. If it hasn't been spotted by your crew, then you can't see it. So invisible tanks are a feature of World of Tanks, and it's one way of implementing it. You know, you can't see a tank, and in World of Tanks you literally can't see the tank. You kind of dependent on your... I mean, it all comes down to view range and the vagaries of the spotting system, because it's not... In World of Tanks, that is probably one of the least clear game mechanics. It's one of the ones that's hardest to understand, and even when you've got a semi-decent understanding of it, it can still really trip you up sometimes. The unexpected things can pop out, and it's like, obviously this is within the parameters of the spotting system, but it's just totally unexpected to the player. War Thunder is very different. Everything is always visible to everyone, essentially. And when you're in the arcade mode, because this is one of the differences, obviously there's this kind of tiered system in War Thunder where you've got arcade realistic and full-on hardcore simulator. When you're in arcade mode, basically there are tags above the enemy tanks and planes, and that is dependent on your crew having noticed that they're there. But even if the crew hasn't noticed they're there, you can actually still physically see them, because they're always rendered even if they're not spotted. And that is a really critical difference, especially when it comes to ground forces, because when you're flying around, you know, you might see an enemy plane off in the distance, but it's just a tiny speck, and it's okay, you know it's there, but you don't know what it is. And while that doesn't matter too much for planes, where it is just a speck in the distance, in ground forces you actually have much more capacity to fire at that speck in the distance, although most engagements are going to be taking place at much closer ranges. But that said, it is entirely possible, especially with the higher rank vehicles, for engagements to be taking place at, you know, kilometre plus ranges, and that just wouldn't happen in World of Tanks. You know, you're not going to be shooting at stuff with planes at that distance, whereas it's entirely feasible to shoot at tanks over that distance. So even if your crew hasn't spotted somebody, let's say you're playing one of I mean, in arcade mode, okay, it can be harder to tell because it doesn't identify friendly tanks very well. So let's say you see a tank off in the distance, and it's actually entirely possible, if you're not paying attention to the minimap, where the information's not very well laid out on the minimap, to be honest. If you're not looking at the minimap, you might see a tank in the distance and go, haha, that's an enemy, and shoot them, and it turns out to be a friendly. I personally haven't had that experience yet, but I'm sure it's possible. Whereas if you're playing one of the modes where it's essentially a kind of a national confrontation, if you're in a Russian tank and you see a German tank off in the distance, you know that is an enemy tank, and even if your crew hasn't spotted it, you can then start opening fire. Now this is a very big change, because it, combined with the way that RNG works, the way that it's all about module damage, where you could either get one-shotted or survive 50 hits in a row. It makes the game play a lot differently. It makes the game everyone's a lot more cautious, because the best way to stay alive is not to get shot, and the best way not to get shot is not to get spotted, and it therefore follows that most people are going to be very cautious, if not just outright campy, and therefore the game has a very, very different feel than World of Tanks. I was initially, the first matches I was playing on the closed beta test server, I was kind of thinking, okay, this is what I do in World of Tanks, so I'm going to try this. And of course, none of it worked. All that knowledge was just out the window, because it just feels and plays so differently. I mean, at its core, it's a tank game. You're in a tank, you fire at other tanks, and yes, they have that in common, but that's about all they have in common. You know, that and the era that it's set in. So yeah, I know people have in the past threatened mass exodus from one to the other, and actually, having looked at, you know, the War Thunder forums, people have been threatening the same from there, but World of Warplanes turned out to be a bit of a damp squib, so yeah. The grass is always greener, like I said. I don't think there's going to be any mass exodus. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people that play both, and there's no reason why you can't play both, because they're both free to play, but I would be very surprised if there's great numbers of people that just entirely quit playing one so they can go and play the other. It's just, it's too different a sort of game, and if you like a lot of the stuff that makes World of Tanks what it is, War Thunder just doesn't have that. Some people will make the switch, undoubtedly, but I don't think it's going to be that many, all things considered. So, hopefully I've covered some of the core points. You know, I'm not trying to be totally comprehensive here. I'm sure I've missed some stuff out. I'm sure people in the comments section will disagree with me on some points. But hey, I'm open to new, you know, points of view. I'm hoping to maybe even get some kind of discussion going here. You know, a civil one would be nice, with people not pointing and calling people names, and you know, but hey, it's YouTube comments. That said, though, you know, I'm quite pleased that most people commenting under my videos are generally quite polite to each other, so that's a step up from most places on you know, most channels on YouTube. It's quite nice that there's that general tone of civility. Maybe it won't last as the channel sort of slowly gets bigger, but for now I quite enjoy it that it's that way. So, like I said, yeah, if you've got anything to add or any points of disagreement, say below. If you like the video, if you feel it gives some idea of the flavour of both games, you can hit the like button, you can subscribe to my channel, you can check out some of my other videos, and of course, as always, stay tuned for more.